You just made the kill of the season. More meat than your group can eat in a week, maybe more. And right now, standing over it in the freezing air, you have exactly one problem: keeping it edible long enough to matter. You have no idea how long enough even is. 2 days? 5? You've watched meat turn before, in warmer months, watched it go from food to something nobody would touch. Flies first, then the smell, then nothing left worth saving. But it's cold today. Genuinely cold. Your breath hangs in the air in front of you. And something about that cold is nagging at the back of your mind. Some half-formed thought you haven't fully connected yet. Would the cold actually change anything? You don't know. Nobody in your group has ever tested it on purpose. There's no manual for this. No one to ask. Just meat, freezing air, and a decision you need to make before predators smell the kill from a mile away. Most people assume ancient humans had no real way to keep food edible beyond a day or two. Eat it fast, or lose it. That assumption isn't quite right, and the reason why involves something that had been sitting in plain sight the entire time, waiting to be noticed. Think about your options for a second. You could eat as much as possible right now. Force feed yourself past comfortable, past full, into genuinely uncomfortable, just to make sure nothing goes to waste. You could try smoking it over a fire, a method your group already knows, though it takes real time and constant attention you might not have today. Or you could do something nobody has really tried before. Leave it out here, in the cold, and see what happens. That third option feels like a gamble. It feels like doing nothing, dressed up as a plan. But something about the stiffness already forming on the meat's surface, something about how different it feels compared to meat left out on a warm day, keeps pulling your attention back to it. Here's what makes this moment genuinely uncertain. You have no guarantee the cold does anything at all beyond making the meat unpleasant to handle. For all you know, it spoils exactly the same way, just slower to notice, because your hands are too numb to check properly. Testing this idea costs you something real if you're wrong. A wasted kill, a hungrier week, maybe worse. So do you take the safer, known path? Or do you trust a hunch that's never been tested by anyone you know? Before we find out what actually happened, it helps to understand exactly what spoiling even is. Because the answer changes everything about why cold might matter here at all. Meat spoils because of activity, not simply because time passes. Bacteria already present on the surface of any piece of meat begin multiplying rapidly once conditions allow it, feeding on the tissue, breaking it down, producing the smell and texture changes that eventually make something inedible or genuinely dangerous to eat. Warmth accelerates this process dramatically. Bacteria that might take a week to cause serious spoilage in cold conditions can cause the same level of damage in a single day when it's warm enough. This means spoiling was never a fixed timeline. It was a race, bacteria against time, and temperature was quietly controlling how fast that race actually moved, long before anyone understood bacteria existed at all. Now picture a different scene entirely, somewhere far colder than where your kill happened. A group living much farther north, in a landscape where the ground itself never fully thaws, encounters something strange during a routine dig. Meat, buried accidentally months earlier and forgotten, comes back up looking nearly the same as the day it went into the ground. That single discovery, repeated independently across different groups in different cold regions, is likely how the connection between cold and preservation actually solidified into deliberate practice, rather than pure accident. If this part surprised you, that something as simple as forgotten meat resurfacing intact might have been one of the more important accidental discoveries in the story of human food storage, sit with that for a second. Because it means a genuine breakthrough didn't require intelligence or experimentation at all. It just required someone paying attention when something unexpected happened. Let's go back to your situation now, because the choice you're facing has a real, documented answer, and it comes from somewhere far more permanent than a single hunter's gamble. In the Arctic regions of what is now Alaska, Inupiat communities developed structures called ice cellars, deep pits dug directly into permafrost, ground that stays frozen year-round, no matter the season above it. Archaeological and anthropological research on these ice cellars including work led by researcher Ann Jensen studying sites near Utqiagvik, has documented their use stretching back centuries, functioning as natural, permanent freezers capable of storing whale and seal meat for extended periods without any mechanical cooling involved at all. This wasn't a lucky one-time discovery. This was an entire storage system, built directly into the landscape, relying on a simple physical fact. Dig deep enough into permanently frozen ground, and you create a space cold enough to stop spoiling almost entirely. Picture what that means practically. A successful hunt, instead of creating a narrow window of days before the meat became worthless, could now feed a group across weeks, potentially months. Stretching a single stroke of luck into sustained survival through periods when hunting conditions were poor or entirely impossible. Now think about this for a moment. If your entire survival depended on stretching a good hunt as far as possible, and you discovered a hole in the ground that could make food last for months instead of days, how differently do you think that would change everything else about how your group planned, moved, and settled in one place? Natural evidence of cold's preserving power existed outside of intentional storage too, and some of it is almost impossible to ignore once you know to look for it. Frozen mammoth remains, discovered across Siberia over the centuries, have repeatedly been found in genuinely remarkable condition, skin, fur, and in some cases, even stomach contents remaining intact, after being trapped in permafrost for thousands of years. Ancient humans encountering a frozen carcass like this, long before any formal understanding of decay, would have seen something that shouldn't have been possible under any other circumstance they'd ever witnessed. Flesh that simply hadn't rotted, held in place by nothing but cold. A discovery from far more recent history adds another striking layer to this pattern, even though the individual involved wasn't ancient food storage at all. In 1991, hikers discovered a human body preserved in ice high in the Alps, a man researchers now call Ötzi, who had died more than 5,000 years earlier. His skin, his clothing, even the contents of his final meal, survived that entire span of time, specifically because ice had locked everything in place, halting the decay that would have destroyed the evidence within weeks under normal conditions. Ötzi wasn't preserved on purpose, but his discovery proves, in the most direct way possible, exactly the same principle ancient hunters were working with when they buried meat in frozen ground. Cold doesn't just slow decay. Under the right conditions, it can stop it almost entirely for an extraordinarily long time. There's a detail about ice cellar construction that rarely gets mentioned, and it shows this wasn't a crude or careless system. Depth mattered enormously. A shallow pit might freeze solid in winter, but partially thaw during brief warm spells, risking the meat stored inside. Digging deep enough to reach permafrost that genuinely never thawed, regardless of surface temperature swings, required real effort, and more importantly, real understanding of which depth actually guaranteed safety. This wasn't guesswork repeated blindly. It was a lesson learned, almost certainly, from watching earlier, shallower attempts fail. Not every ancient group had equal access to this solution, and that gap shaped entire ways of life differently across regions. Communities living somewhere permafrost existed had a genuinely powerful, permanent storage tool available to them. Communities in warmer climates had no equivalent, forcing them to rely entirely on other preservation methods like smoking, drying, or salting, each with its own limitations and its own labor demands. A group heading into a harsh winter with a full ice cellar faced a fundamentally different set of risks than a group without one. Food security wasn't just about hunting skill anymore. It was about geography, about whether the ground beneath your feet happened to offer this kind of natural advantage at all. Seasonal timing added another layer of complexity that experienced groups likely tracked closely. Digging into permafrost during the height of summer, when the very top layer of ground briefly softened, was almost certainly easier than attempting the same task in the dead of winter, when the surface itself could be frozen too hard to break through with primitive tools. This meant ice cellars were likely prepared well in advance of when they were actually needed, a form of long-term planning built entirely around understanding the ground's yearly rhythm. Picture a group working through several days of difficult digging in late summer, well before the harsh months arrive, preparing a storage pit they won't actually need for months. That kind of delayed payoff labor, work now for benefit much later, represents a genuinely sophisticated level of planning, especially in a world with no calendar and no written record to rely on. The science behind why cold works this well deserves a closer look here, because the effect is more dramatic than most people assume. Bacterial reproduction slows significantly as temperatures drop, and near freezing, most of the bacteria responsible for spoilage become effectively dormant, unable to multiply at any meaningful rate at all. This is fundamentally different from simply making meat less appealing to handle. It's an almost complete pause on the biological process that causes spoilage in the first place. This also explains something that likely puzzled early users of ice cellars before they fully trusted the method. Meat removed from a cellar could smell and look essentially identical to the day it went in, even after a shockingly long stretch of time. That kind of result, repeated consistently enough, is exactly what turns a risky first attempt into a trusted, permanent practice passed down through a community. If this part surprised you, that near-freezing temperatures don't just slow bacteria, but can functionally stop them from multiplying at all, that's worth sitting with for a moment. Because it reframes an ice cellar as something closer to biological suspension than simple storage. Cold-based preservation wasn't limited to the Arctic either, and looking beyond permafrost regions reveals just how widely this same basic idea eventually spread once people understood it. In ancient Persia, structures called yakchals were being built as early as around 400 years before the Common Era, tall, dome-shaped buildings specifically engineered to store ice collected during winter months and keep it frozen through brutally hot desert summers. These structures used clever passive cooling techniques, thick insulating walls, and carefully designed airflow to maintain freezing temperatures inside, even while the outside world baked under intense heat. This means ancient Persian engineers weren't simply relying on naturally cold ground the way Arctic communities did. They were actively engineering an artificial cold environment from scratch, in a climate that offered them no natural advantage at all, purely because the value of preserved ice and food was worth that level of sustained effort. Records from ancient China point to a similarly deliberate relationship with cold storage. Texts dating back to around the 7th century before the Common Era describe ice being harvested during winter and stored specifically for later use, including food preservation during warmer months. This wasn't an isolated regional curiosity. It was a pattern repeating itself, independently, across civilizations separated by enormous distances, all arriving at some version of the same fundamental idea once they had the means to pursue it. Now think about that pattern for a second. Groups with zero contact between them, across entirely different continents and climates, kept landing on the exact same core insight: find a way to keep things cold, and food lasts dramatically longer. That kind of repeated, independent discovery usually points to something less like luck and more like an unavoidable conclusion, waiting to be found by anyone paying close enough attention. Ancient Rome offers one more example worth mentioning, this time showing how far people were willing to go once the value of cold storage became clear. Wealthy Roman households arranged for ice and snow to be transported down from mountain regions, stored in insulated pits, and used to preserve food and cool drinks during warm months. An entire logistics effort built around a resource that had to travel real distances just to remain useful. This wasn't casual convenience. It was a demonstrated willingness to invest serious effort and resources purely because the payoff, extended food security and improved quality of life, was considered worth it. There's a physical detail about ice itself that made all of this even more effective, something beyond simple low temperature. Ice doesn't just sit at a cold temperature. As it slowly melts, it absorbs a significant amount of heat from its surroundings in the process, actively pulling warmth out of anything stored near it rather than simply existing passively alongside it. This means a well-packed store of ice didn't just represent cold, It represented an active, ongoing cooling process, continuously working for as long as ice remained. Salt eventually entered this picture too, in a discovery that likely built directly on existing knowledge of both preservation methods separately. Mixing salt into ice lowers its melting point significantly, allowing the resulting mixture to reach temperatures well below what plain ice alone could achieve. Ancient people who combined these two known preservation tools, whether by accident or genuine experimentation, would have created an even more powerful cooling effect than either method offered on its own. Though this specific combination likely developed later than basic ice storage itself. Let's return to your situation one final time, because by now, the outcome should feel less like a gamble and more like an obvious choice. You leave the meat out in the cold, tucked away from direct sun, protected as best you can from scavengers. You don't know the word bacteria. You don't know permafrost exists somewhere far north of you, or that people an ocean away are building entire structures around this same principle. All you know is what your own senses are telling you. This cold feels different, and the meat feels different because of it. Days later, when you check on it, it hasn't rotted the way it should have by now. It's still meat, still usable, still food when your group needs it most. That single moment of trust, choosing the untested cold over the known risk of waste, repeated across countless individuals in countless different environments over an enormous span of time, is likely how humanity first began building a genuine, working relationship with cold as a tool, rather than simply an obstacle to survive. Children growing up in communities with established ice cellars would have absorbed this knowledge, almost passively, simply by watching adults maintain and use these structures year after year. A boy helping carry meat down into a frozen pit, feeling the sudden drop in temperature the moment he stepped below ground level, would have understood something fundamental about cold and preservation long before anyone explained the reasoning behind it in words. Knowledge like this rarely needed formal teaching. It needed only repeated, consistent demonstration. Maintenance of these frozen storage sites likely became its own specialized skill within a community, and that detail is easy to overlook. An ice cellar wasn't something you dug once and ignored. Entry points needed careful insulation to prevent warm air from repeatedly flooding in. Stored food needed organizing, likely oldest near the entrance and freshest deeper inside, to prevent unnecessary exposure every time someone needed a portion. Someone within the group likely became genuinely skilled at managing this system efficiently, understanding its quirks better than anyone else, holding a quiet but real form of practical expertise. Trust in this method almost certainly built slowly, tested repeatedly before becoming fully reliable practice. Early users of primitive ice storage likely experienced failures alongside successes, cellars that weren't dug deep enough, entrances that weren't properly sealed, meat that spoiled anyway, due to some factor not yet understood. Each failure taught something. Each success reinforced what had actually worked. This trial and improvement process, stretched out across generations rather than a single lifetime, is likely how a risky first experiment eventually transformed into a completely trusted survival system. Consider what it would have meant to be the person responsible for deciding when a cellar was finally ready for use, and when it wasn't. That judgment carried real weight. Declare a cellar safe too early, and an entire winter's food supply could be lost to spoilage discovered only after it was too late to recover. Wait too long out of excessive caution, and valuable storage capacity sat unused while food that could have been saved was wasted instead. This wasn't a decision made lightly, and the people who consistently made it likely earned exactly the kind of quiet, practical respect that came from keeping an entire group fed through the hardest months of the year. There's one more detail worth sitting with before we close this out. None of the people responsible for these discoveries, the hunter testing frozen ground for the first time, the Arctic communities perfecting ice cellars, the Persian engineers building yakhchals from scratch, ever received individual credit for what they built. Their names are gone. Their reasoning is gone. What remains is simply the practice itself, refined, repeated, and passed down until it became something so basic to survival that eventually nobody even remembered a time before it existed. Weather patterns across different years likely added an extra layer of uncertainty that even experienced groups couldn't fully eliminate. An unusually warm winter could threaten the reliability of a cellar that had worked perfectly for years before, forcing a group to adapt on short notice rather than relying blindly on past success. This meant even a well-established system demanded ongoing attention rather than passive trust, a reminder that nature rarely offered guarantees, only patterns reliable enough to plan around most of the time. So the next time you open a refrigerator without thinking twice about it, remember that the core idea behind it, cold slows decay, cold makes food last, isn't a modern invention at all. It's one of the oldest working relationships humans ever built with their environment, discovered independently again and again by people with nothing but frozen ground, careful observation, and a willingness to trust what their own senses were telling them, long before anyone could explain exactly why it worked.